power in Parliament. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Drummond. Well, I think that the question is going to be well answered, if I can answer it rapidly. It's an excellent question. I don't understand why the Liberals are so obstinate in not wanting to even discuss this in the first place. Protecting 78 seats, I'm proud of having received that victory, but that's not the end of the match. We have to be open to this kind of discussion. The Liberals have to be open to this discussion. I don't understand why Quebec Liberals aren't open to this. I'm sure that they talk about it in their caucus. Why don't they talk about this more strongly to say, at the very least, let's vote for this motion, let's have a discussion at committee, and thereafter we can see what kind of results we can move towards. Preserving 78 seats was a good first step, an essential first step, but that is not the end of the story. It's not the end of this historic request from Quebec. We have time for a quick question.
Reprise de débat, resuming debate. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be sharing my time, and this really is quite incredible. There is one day in the entire life of Parliament that is set aside for debate about the state of our democracy, and in particular, the rules of order that govern this place. And unfortunately, we see other parties that want to debate a different motion and therefore overwhelm the time set aside for this important debate on the health of Parliament and the health of our democracy. In particular, the member for Winnipeg North, who seems to be the only person speaking most of the time in the government caucus, has already eaten 40 minutes of the day that would otherwise have been set aside for this conversation on the standing orders, the rules of Parliament, the state of our democracy. And it's very clear why the Liberals don't want to have a debate about the state of our democracy and the rules that govern it. The sad truth is that ours is a Parliament in decline. This is evident to many of us and is shown in the objective metrics of the health of our democracy. Now, under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the use of time allocation and prorogation of Parliament provoked conniptions from Liberals and from the commentariat, concerned that such measures were hurting democracy by curtailing debate and limiting the ability of other parties to hold the government accountable. But today, the Liberals, with the NDP support, not only regularly use time allocation to limit debate, but have normalized the routine use of programming motions which completely skip over whole stages of deliberation on bills, including blocking all committee study and preventing opportunities from amendment. These parties have gone from being apoplectic about any limiting of time at a particular stage of a bill to passing motions to whole-scale skip stages of consideration. And this Parliament has also spent substantial portions of the last few years suspended, and when it sits, it is partially reduced to a Zoom call. Duly elected members of Parliament and their staff are barred from entering Parliament because of personal health choices, even while those same people do mix unmasked and unvaccinated with staff and MPs at receptions that are only a block away. Now, many of the same people who decried time allocation under Stephen Harper now defend the wholesale running over of the normal functioning of this institution on multiple fronts as allegedly necessary to prevent the so-called playing of partisan games and delay tactics, as if members of Parliament were obliged to do everything possible to pass government legislation quickly without serious review. And now today we have motion 11, another attack on democracy. It allows the government to change the adjournment time at will without any notice and without a vote, making it extremely difficult by design for opposition politicians to do their jobs. And Madam Chair, we're not just a Parliament in decline, we're a democracy in decline. To observe as much as not to say that we've ceased to be a democracy, but that our democracy is weakening and we need to act in response. The globally recognized authority on democracy measurement is called IDEA, the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. It's based in Stockholm. IDEA recognizes that democracy is not an absolute. It is a measure of a country's performance across a series of metrics, such as representative government, impartial institutions, and fundamental rights. Now, according to IDEA, Canada's performance on key variables of checks on government and effective parliament are in sharp decline. Our performance in terms of checks on government at 0.68 is lower than the United States and any nation in Western Europe. Our score for effective parliament has dropped precipitously from 0.73 in 2015 to 0.59 now, so just barely above the world average. It's not just conservatives who say that our parliament is in decline. It's the world-leading experts responsible for measuring the health of parliaments and parliamentary democracies that say we are a parliament in decline. Now, I don't have time, unfortunately, to do a complete analysis of democratic decline in Canada, but I do want to talk about what we should be talking about today, which is how the proper functioning of the standing orders provides tools for us to resist democratic decline. As the rules of the House of Commons, the standing orders have a particular role to play in trying to help preserve the vitality of our institutions. Now, the purpose of Parliament is to bring Canadians together, chosen by and who speak for the experience of different localities, to deliberate about the common good of the whole nation and to pass laws in accordance with it. Within that, the role of the standing orders is to prescribe the form of that deliberation. Who gets to speak for how long and in what ways on what subjects, balancing the need to hear from a multiplicity of perspectives with the need to proceed with legislation in a reasonable amount of time. The standing orders and traditions of this place are finely tuned to achieve that necessary balance. Now, ultimately, in a democracy, the majority should have its way, but the rules of this House exist to some extent to slow down the majority, to give other points of view the opportunity to be heard, and to create space for the minority to try to persuade the majority. Democracy is the idea that the majority should rule, but not that the majority is always right. Majorities can get vital issues wrong. In particular, since the dawn of democracy, thinkers have worried about how the stimulation of short-term passions in the majority can make for a kind of mob rule mentality and lead to bad decision-making. Even unanimous decisions stirred up around short-term impulses and passions can be deeply regretted afterwards when the tyranny of the moment has passed. And the framers of modern democracies perceive these risks. They have noted that the world's first democracy killed the world's first known philosopher. Modern democracy has sought to improve on ancient mob rule by liberating the people from both the tyranny of elites and the tyranny of short-term thinking, and has thus sought to stimulate decision-making based on the considered judgment of the people over time. The majority should rule, but should still be expected to hear contrary points of view and to sleep on their decisions before finalizing them. Such requirements still do not provide a guarantee of right decision-making, but they do improve the chances. Individuals and collectives make better decisions when they think about those decisions first. So this is a key function of Parliament in general and of the standing orders in particular, to create the time and space required for authentic deliberative democracy, for the considered judgment of the people over time. Those who have developed and refined Parliament as both an expression of, but also a check on majoritarianism, understood well that proportionate deliberation increases the chance that the majority will get both the big and the small questions right and without unintended consequences. Now, the standing orders that we have aren't perfect, but they are generally tuned to help strike this vital balance between majority rule and deliberation. But a problem which is substantially driving the decline of our Parliament today is not so much the standing orders themselves, actually, but it's the casualness with which the rules contained therein are frequently abridged. Now, in principle, if rules are established and structures are as they should be, there's no need to abridge them. And yet it is a veritable constant that we hear some delegate of the government rise in the House to propose that the House take some action, notwithstanding any standing order or usual practice of the House. Every time we accept this, we are choosing to act contrary to that long-standing wisdom, and as such, we should be very careful. Unanimous consents, even on mundane procedural matters, involve the House derogating from established practice. I'm certainly not against the limited use of this abridgment in such cases, but I still think we should acknowledge the risks. Much worse is what we see more and more in this Parliament is the way that the House frequently goes beyond rule abridgment by unanimous consent for procedural simplicity, and we're now operating under a series of special rules passed by a majority of the House over the objections of the minority that fundamentally change our operating practices to limit opposition input and government accountability. We have government programming motions, which I've already discussed, and we have the routine efforts of members of the House to get the House to pronounce itself on substantive issues through unanimous consent without notice, where members are asked to unanimously endorse something, oppose something, or even adopt a piece of legislation at all stages with no advance notice or debate. Now, the use of these unanimous consent motions does respond to a real problem that members of Parliament do not, I think, have enough opportunity to put substantive proposals forward. And I would support changes to our standing orders that expand the available opportunities for members to put forward substantive motions or private members' bills for debate. But I still suspect that even with those opportunities, we'd see MPs standing up out of the blue and expect the entire House to pronounce itself on substantive matters without formal notice or debate, and we will still see government motions that try to abridge long-established standing orders. Those who obsessively use unanimous consent motions are perhaps unwittingly seeking to abridge vital checks and balances and bring us back to democratic mob rule, where the tyranny of the moment, instead of the considered judgment of the people over time, is what rules. I oppose these efforts to roll the clock back to a purely majoritarian democracy instead of a functioning deliberative democracy. The use of unanimous consent motions also lends itself to significant gamesmanship. Efforts to move such motions when particular members are out of the House, or to actively engage certain members in conversation so that they will not notice that a motion is being moved. It is a given with committee assignments and other responsibilities that all members aren't able to be in the House all day. That is why we have, for instance, bells before votes. Unanimous consent motions override the rights of members who are not present. So the standing orders and the Speaker should work to preserve and protect the rights of members and the health of our deliberative democracy by constraining these kinds of standing orders.
Excuse, un ordre au règlement et je pense
We have a point of order. I think I know what it is, but I will ask the member for Drummond. Yes, two little things, Madam Speaker, and these are two valid points. The key point is I'm looking for a link between my colleague's passionate speech and the Bloc Québécois proposal to widen the scope of C14 at PROC. There may be a link between the two, but I would like to hear that. I'd like to hear what it is. And the second thing, I don't want to criticize my colleague's eloquent style, but his very fast speaking style means that our interpreters are having some difficulty following, and it's very important for us to be able to follow what he's saying. So I'm just asking that very respectfully. I appreciate the honorable member's comments, and it is an important matter. The honorable member does have a fast speaking rate. It can be difficult for the interpreters to follow. It may be difficult for them to interpret appropriately at that speed. It's not the first time we've raised this in the House, not just for this member, but for others. So if you could slow down a little, that would enable interpretation to be more accurate. They may have access to the member's speaking notes, and if not, I would ask members to ensure that their speeches are provided to interpreters. Regarding the content of the speech, I would just like to say that it's very important to ensure that the discussion in the House must be about the issue itself. But we also should recognize that there is leeway. So I'm sure that the member will ensure that the discussion ultimately comes back to the motion before the House. The honourable member.
Sherwood Park, Saskatchewan has 1 minute and 16 seconds, and I would just ask him to slow down a little bit so during the rest of his speech.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Of course, the Bloc members point out we're into a debate on a different motion than what was scheduled for today, which was the one day where we're supposed to be talking about the rules of the House and the impact on our democracy. But I will endeavor to make the link. The standing orders and the Speaker, I believe, should work to preserve and protect the rights of members and the health of our democracy by constraining these practices of standing order abridgment. Requests for unanimous consent motions should not be entertained outside of certain very narrow circumstances, and those circumstances should involve a required consultation with all elected members, not just 3 or 4. The standing order should constrain the use of programming motions, such as through prohibiting the use of time allocation or closure on a programming motion. The deadly combination of a programming motion and closure is allowing the government to pass a bill at all stages in an afternoon. By constraining their own abridgment, the standing orders could reduce these abuses that are weakening our parliament and roll us back towards unconsidered mob rule. I have no desire to see our parliament reduced to a body that ritualistically gives perfunctory approval to bills which ministers assure us are very good while endorsing unconsidered motions simply because they sound nice at first hearing. Our parliamentary democracy, providing the mechanisms for the people's representatives to genuinely debate about important ideas over a reasonable period of time, is worth defending and preserving. And that is the issue we need to be discussing today. And yet we have Liberal members that want to talk, one in particular, that want to talk for a great deal of time on a different block motion, a motion that we are formally debating right now, that we could be debating at any time. They want to discuss it at great length to avoid this vital conversation about the health of our democracy, and that's shameful.
So again, I'll just remind the member that he needs to slow down a little bit when he's speaking. I know he's very passionate, as was mentioned, but it is very difficult for the interpreters to follow, and it is, again, important that all of the members within the House are able to understand the speech that is being delivered. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader in the Senate.
Thank you very much,
Madam Speaker. And I guess it's in true form that Conservatives and the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan would somehow blame the government for the motion that we're debating today. But nonetheless, during his speech, I heard him speak at length about the freedoms of democracy. And he mentioned that that democracy is in decline in Canada. Well, I would refer him to an organization called the Freedom House. The Freedom House has been around for 80 years now. It was developed towards the latter half of World War II. It's an organization that enjoys bipartisan support in the United States, and it's an organization that rates freedoms throughout the world. It rates specifically political and civil freedoms. And of those ratings, of the 210 countries that it rates, Canada comes in 5th. Canada gets a score of 40 out of 40 for political rights and 58 out of 60 for civil liberties. How is it possible that this member is able to suggest that the freedoms in Canada and the democracy that basically those freedoms, or democracy that is relied on by those freedoms, is somehow in jeopardy, given the fact that this organization...
Sorry, I do have to allow for other questions. The honourable member Sherwood Park, Saskatchewan. And I find that the questions, there's lots of preamble. I would just ask the members to shorten their preamble and get straight to the question and comments as quickly as possible. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Saskatchewan.
Okay, Madam Speaker, the member didn't listen, or he didn't want to listen. The idea, the organization that I referred to that ranks global democracies across a series of metrics, they draw on various metrics, and Freedom House is part of the input data that IDEA uses. IDEA ranks democratic performance across a range of metrics, civil liberties, checks on government, pluralism, and other metrics. What I said is that specifically on the metric of checks on government, I didn't talk about civil liberties, actually. There are issues there, but I didn't talk about it. On the issue of checks on government, our objective ranking is declining. And the member's question completely ignored my comment on how checks on government and metrics on effective parliament are in decline. We've dropped massively on checks on government and effective parliament in international rankings since 2015. That's a different metric from civil liberties. It's an extremely important metric, and that member should be aware of the difference.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague, but I'd like to bring him back to the subject under debate, C14, Quebec representation. We've had Charlottetown, which talked about 25% representation for Quebec with regard to members here in the House. So what does my colleague think of that specific issue? Thank you.
L'honorable député de Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, puis encore, s'il peut ralentir un petit peu.
And if the member doesn't mind slowing down a bit again.
Madam Chair, just with respect to these issues of representation, of course, Conservatives supported the bill saying that no province should drop in its number of seats, and I mean, I think I've been clear about that. I also think the principle of representation by population is an important principle in our democracy, and I think we need to recognize that Quebec's identity is important, Alberta's identity is important, British Columbia's identity is important, and that every person in this country needs their voice to be heard in the House. That's my view. But if Parliament isn't functioning properly, if Parliament isn't a mechanism where individual MPs can actually be heard and where they can actually check the power of government and debate legislation, and the standing orders aren't working properly, if Parliament isn't working properly, then it barely matters who's here, because Parliament is prevented from doing its job. So I think even prior to the issues the member is raising is the question of, is Parliament able to be that deliberative assembly of one nation or not? That's what's, I think, really important.
On attend pour une brève question. The honourable parliamentary secretary of the government House Leader, a brief question.
Yes, Madam Speaker, the member makes reference to unanimous consent motions, and in most part I agree with what he is saying. The question that I have for him is, does he believe that the Speaker's chair has some authority to be able to use the discretion, as we've been witnessing over the last little while, to clamp down on UC motions? There should be an expectation. There's discussions and approval prior to actually standing up and introducing. His thoughts on that.
A brief answer from the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Madam Speaker, I have no choice but to find myself in violent agreement with the member that there should be proper consultations. I would just emphasize that those consultations should be with members of the House and not just with leaders or House leaders of recognized parties. When there's a unanimous consent motion, the idea is that the House as a whole is expressing itself. I think there needs to be a mechanism for all members of the House to be properly and officially informed prior, just like we have with bells in the normal notice procedure. That is extremely important to protect the rights, not just of parties, but of all members.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam